All right, this is Zoroastrianism. Now, just honest confession, how many of you have ever, like, is Zoroastrianism a totally foreign word? Do anyone have any sort of like, hey, I remember studying that at some point in world religion? So this is like, what on earth are we studying?
Saw the movie Zorro.
Yes, saw the movie Zorro. That's, it is, and honestly, that's funny because I think that most people think that. When I was in seminary, I met someone who was a Farsi. Is that a term that's familiar with you? Now, that's interesting because Farsis are a resurgence group of Zoroastrianism that came out, I believe, sort of Western India into Pakistan, or where most of them are, and the Farsi people are still active today. Zoroastrianism as a religious expression today is not big. You're talking really, and there are lots of different estimates, but from 110 to 120,000, 100,000. So it's 100, yeah.
Farsi, just for a second. There's a language Farsi, isn't there?
Yes.
Yes. Is that to be confused with this religion? Is it part of it? Or?
To be honest with you, I don't know. Now that you say that, my guess would be that they would be. Do you want me to find out right this second? Will it make a difference? My guess would be yes, but I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, when I was doing a program in San Antonio called Operation Scoville, we'd get children in and give them clothes.
And so Farsi is, I know Farsi is a language. My guess would be the yes, because it comes from that region of Iran all the way into the western side of the Indian Peninsula. So, you know, you're going to have to use we're going to talk about different regions of the Persian Empire, but when I say the peak of India, that all makes sense to you, how India sort of comes down in a peak over there. And then if you go from your angle left, you go over here, and then you have Iran and Iraq and that sort of middle, and then it goes over farther, you have Israel down to Egypt over here.
Did you say it's the oldest?
It is considered by those who study religion the oldest established religion. In other words, it's the oldest organized form of religion that has sustained itself, although it draws its roots, and we'll talk about the history in a second, it draws its roots into that Indo-Asian, Central Asian religion of what eventually becomes Hinduism in the East, and Greek philosophy in the West.
Older than Judaism?
Yes, older than Judaism, absolutely. And it actually is considered a precursor. And what will be interesting, and it's hard to tell when these thoughts were established, but the overlap between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is striking. And so, but I'll get into the history and how that came to be shortly. In the U.S., there are about 14,000, which is not very many, and that's sort of Zoroastrians. That's not those who would consider that part of the Farsi. And I don't know if I really don't. I have to look into that. I don't really have any idea. But and maybe I'm mispronouncing it, but it's or maybe it's Parsi, Parsis, but I think it's but it is that is a term that is taken from the term Persia, because we have to think in the mind of Persia, where Persia is. And again, if you have Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran, I think I'm doing this from the right direction, trying to do it from your direction. That forms that region. And this is sort of what is really considered, that whole region is considered sort of the birthplace of human civilization. So when we talked way back many, many weeks ago about the early religions coming up and hunters and gatherers, we're going to talk about those herding communities, and how those things developed out of their eye. And so we're looking back kind of to that first week where we said these things developed from nomadian type people, and it wasn't until they started to gather in urban type centers or cities and centers that you have development of more organized thought, because obviously you have more people in a larger question of how do we live our lives, and all of a sudden ethics and morals make a heck of a lot more when you're living in an urban environment or an environment where there are more people than if you're out by yourself. you don't have that same level of interaction. We call it Zoroastrianism because that's what the Greeks call it, and so we've borrowed from them. But those who identify as Zoroastrians would actually, the word is Mazdayasna, so Mazde Asna, and what that means is worshiper of wisdom. In the essence of the idea is that you are a worshiper of the idea of wisdom, and wisdom in a Zoroastrian context is birthed or experienced or felt in the element of water. Water and fire will play a major role, but in particular fire. But wisdom is sort of the necessity of water, the prevalence of water. It's all water ties into this idea that that's foundational, and always never ending, always flowing sort of thing. If you're concerned about that falling on you, feel free to turn it off if that's concern. The most right now, Zoroastrians are in India, and then Iran, and then actually North America. So again, the vast majority of them are somewhere in India. It is originally a Iranian, or what we would call originally a Persian religion. It shares much with the ancient Iranian religions, which are considered Vedic, is the term that they use around. I'm sure I wrote a definition of it somewhere around here. I probably will come to it. My notes are a little scattered today. But it's, and also a precursor to Hinduism. Now, I think that we as Christians are going to see way more connections from the actual outplay of how they, when we sort of break it down into the doctrinal, like what do they believe in the afterlife, and what do they believe it mean, the extension of the world, and what does it mean to die, as opposed to, I think when you go east, as we have been going, when you get into Hinduism and Buddhism, as we saw, that notion of reincarnation is not in Zoroastrianism at all. And in fact, they would be considered the first monotheistic religion, which many people think Judaism is. So but they also were battling this notion of polytheism throughout the region as well, because then it was tribal, it was nomadian, and people worshiped the way they did. Zoroaster, the prophet from whom received the revelation that started this as sort of an official religion, if you will. They call him Zarathustra or something like that. He was a prophet, and some people say that he lived 6,000 years before Christ. Although modern day, and that was believed for a long time, but modern day scholarship actually dates much of what happened back to what do they say? 6th century BC. What was happening, if you're trying to put all this together, what was happening in the 6th century BC? The return, the Israelites were exiled, and they went into Persia, and they spent 70 years in Persia, and then you have this, which is around the time of the story of Esther and Susa and that sort of thing. And then they returned to Israel in that same century, because it centers around Cyrus releasing the Persian Empire taking over the Babylonian Empire. And when that happened, Cyrus released all of these sort of refugees and sent them back to their homeland. So Cyrus is considered by Isaiah to be the suffering servant, the one who came and freed the Israelites and brought them back to Jerusalem and gave them money and people and resources to rebuild the temple and to rebuild Jerusalem and to establish themselves as a people, because Cyrus had this vision of it's better to have allies all around than it is to dominate with force. So around this time, modern day scholars will date Zoroaster, the founder, although we don't know. And because of that, there's a great mythology, because when you go 6,000 years to 6,000 years before Christ to 600 years before Christ, that's a pretty wide gap. But for modern scholarship purposes, we'll say that also then some of their texts or some of their holy writings and these things they surfaced around 600, so that's often why they date it back to that. So, but the question becomes, in terms of our own thinking, and I think it's worth considering, is did he was he there previous? And as they started in an era of Persian releasing all these, there was a sense of reestablishing and writing down because it became illiterate or because it was translated into a place of literacy. The question becomes, is this a prophecy of the present day, or is it a prophecy that existed 6,000 years earlier? Because there's also, and in particular, because I have always argued that the reason we're able to accomplish good things is because of the Holy Spirit. And if you want to, and if you want to look back and say, well, if the Holy Spirit wasn't present, then there was still some sense of duty. And I look at the Israelites and I say the Israelites had that sense of duty or law or morality because of the 10 Commandments given after the wilderness, in the wilderness. So after 400 years of slavery, after all Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all of that stuff happened. And Paul even says prior to that Decalogue being given, they weren't held accountable for their sins. But if Zoroastrianism truly dates back to the 6000 BC, it represents for us as human beings the earliest form of sort of morality expressed in a human culture. I am sort of wrestling with this, what that means, because for me in my cosmology, although I don't assign Adam and Eve at the age of 4,000, I think I think we can maybe go back to Abraham-ish and probably date from that. Prior to that, I think it's, I don't ascribe to personally, I don't condemn or ridicule those who ascribe to a literal 7-day creation, but I think those 7 days were epics, and I think those consisted of millions of years. And so by the time humans were supernaturally brought into this world, for us, we don't know when that was. That could have been thousands of years existed. I mean, we don't know how long Adam and Eve were in the garden, presuming there was a literal, metaphysical garden. They could have been there thousands of years for all we know. In fact, historians will often date Cain and Abel at about 3,000, and they'll date Adam and Eve at 4,000. So we often equate Adam and Eve, or Cain and Abel, as being sort of the first children of Adam and Eve, whereas we really have no proof of that. We just know that they were a descendant of, or a generation, generations after. We don't know, but it really doesn't make a difference in the end. Again, the Bible's not necessarily meant to be taken literally every place it is. Otherwise, we need some head coverings, and it is considered it is considered the first monotheistic religion. I did not know this. Again, the amount I knew about Zoroastrianism was probably I could have written on a note card prior to this. And now I only have just 2 pieces of 8.5 by 11, so I haven't got very far. But it's considered the first monotheistic religion. It's considered, which is interesting, considered it was a day and age where polytheism ruled the roost. Remember going back to the sort of Fertile Crescent, the original sort of foundation in that same region. In Hinduism was a polytheistic, and that went east, and in Greek mythology went west. And so it affected, and Plato and Pythagoras were influenced by Zoroastrianism. So just keep that in mind. When you consider how much of our present day thought is affected by someone like Plato, and the fact that he was influenced by Zoroastrianism, it shouldn't be overlooked. Much of the cosmology comes through the sort of dualism of heaven and hell, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. All the Abrahamic religions have tremendous overlap, and you'll see that in a moment when we go through some of the doctrines or the beliefs. You're going to be kind of like, wait a second, because the whole time I was researching, I kept thinking like, okay, was Judaism before? I know Judaism was before this, but I kept wanting it to be before it because I kept wanting to somehow pin it to us. But the reality is, and this is the notion of syncretism, that there are similarities, and we borrow from one another. Again, every major religion, Abrahamic religion, uses sacrifice as a part of their ritual. Well, and then farther east it goes into Hinduism and Buddhism, you have a loss of that, and that's where the major difference happens. But wherever there's regions or cultures, it's going to be influenced in the same way Christianity was majorly influenced by the Greek Hellenization, and perhaps maybe that's the reason we have the doctrine of the Trinity as we do as such. In fact, had the Greeks not invaded, think about this, had the Greeks not invaded or taken over Israel or that region at the time and had zero influence, if they went east instead, and we didn't have the major influence, the question becomes is what would this new form of Judaism that we now call Christianity look like? You can't deny, why do we have a prosperity mentality? Because we live in a day and age of capitalism. There's very little evidence anywhere in the history of Christianity of ever sort of that prosperity mentality rooting its ugly head in the way it does now. Why? Why is that part of the expression of Christianity, even in its extreme forms? And just that notion of God will bless us if we follow God, sort of thing. Well, that's a product of our capitalistic culture and our Protestant work ethic. Work hard and you'll be rewarded. So we're always influenced by the cultures that are around us. So it was considered to, more realistically dated. They go back and say that it was probably founded sometime. Do you need a chair? Just a moment. It was probably founded sometime, or the thought pattern or the ideas around it were probably formulated from about 2000 to about the 6th century. And again, Zoroaster then would have been contemporary with Cyrus the Great, who released the Israelites. It flourished as an Iranian state nation from the first Persian Empire. I know this is not going to mean much to you, but basically what happens is that from 558, about 550 BC. So just to put that in the context of Israelites, again, around the time of the exile, and probably after the Israelites have returned, also a significant time for Christians, Jews, just in the sense of, so two religions emerging and being redefined. And it lasted until 650, and there were basically, and I'm going to go through that in a second, at the time of that reign of 558 or 550s, this was the largest empire ever known to human civilization. The Persians conquered everything. And so even though Israel was its own state and had independence, it was still considered part of and the Persian Empire in this first phase all the way down to all the way down to northern Africa and all the way through India. It was the largest Persian empire up to that point, until they were overtaken by the Muslims. So let's just take a step back. The thought is, whether this happened around 2000 or around 600, which most people would say, is in the Indo-Aryan region of religion, there were corrupt priests, and Zoroaster was considered a priest. And he was tired of the corruption, and eventually, when he was 30 years old, he went down to the river to get some sacred water, and had a vision and saw Ahura Mazda, yes, spelled just like the car, and had a epiphany or a revelation of this God, divine revelation, and decided to go back and basically started reform, and there was good gods and there was bad gods, and he divided the Iranian deities into these two categories of Ahura, which was order and light and goodness and positivity, and Devas, which was bad or evil or those things, and basically did sort of a reform of the Iranian sort of, I want to say folk religion, but it wasn't as organized as it could have been. I think it probably, again, like Hinduism, was very regional. Sorry, I jumped ahead. Prior to that, though, I have an error that I shouldn't have said that till later. But prior to that, when we talked about in our first session the nomadic herding tribes and how they would just go and again until they came together, you had no reason for anything more organized. But they were in Iran and northern India, which is how they get their sort of connection to Hinduism. And then you had this Vedic religion, and that was this sacrificial system of there was a good and there was an evil, and we need to sacrifice in order to preserve ourselves. And it was during the period in Central Asia that to 2000 BC, before Christ, and this is before the Davidic kingdom, which is around 1000. But for the first 300 years, it spread to Iran, and they know this because they have images from this in artwork that go back and to basically a region around India near to the convergence of two rivers. Then you have all the way up to from some sort of this spread to Iran from 550 to 300. You have what's called the Rachanid Empire, and this was around the time again that the Jews returned. And this was also around the time where you have some of that formulation. And here's what's interesting is they called, this is all prior to Christ, they called their priests magi. And they were astronomers. And this is also where we get magic and mage, or the wise, in Christian literature, the wise men. I was always and tend to continue to teach that the magi were one was from India, one was from Persia, and one was from Asia. So this kind of threw me for a loop in the sense of saying, well, that would line itself up with the widespread nature of this religion at the time. So Zoroaster, in other words, go back and think about the time when Israelites were being exiled, 600 to 500, when they were exiled and returned. At this time, you have this stretch of Zoroastrian that goes all the way to India, all the way to Egypt. And then it shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. So, but what's interesting about that is that, so the entire, and if Judaism was also developing in this time, and during that period eventually had the Maccabean revolt and had, this 400 years of silence and all these prophets, the major worldview that the Israelites were competing with was some expression of Zoroastrianism. We don't talk about it, we don't think about it, but it was widespread. And it was 550 to 300 that you have when the Jews returned. From 247 to 222, you have the Parthian Empire. And that's 247 to the present day, and AD 224. And so this is sort of the period that Christ was around on the scene. And again, it shrunk a little bit, but not to the extent, it wasn't in Africa and it wasn't as far as India, but you still have the presence of what we are calling Zoroastrianism as the dominant world religion at the time. Judaism was not the dominant world religion, it was a small tribal. So, and you think about the fact that it comes from Iranian and a Persian influence, and what baffled me as I'm reading all of this is I'm thinking, if this was so present, why in the history and the language of us studying Israelites' history do we not talk about Zoroastrianism? We just talk about, but we really don't identify any of those necessary, and not that there really still weren't tribal religions. There were still, you still have in the 7th, 8th and 7th century leading up to the exile, you still have the stories of Ahab and Jezebel and Baal. So there were still religions that Israel was dealing with, but all the while this larger Persian religion existed. And again, why aren't we talking about this as Christians? And then down to the present day, the 224 to 650 AD, you have the Sasanian Empire. And again, that was in that same region of where India, the left side of India, all the way into with modern day Iran and Pakistan. And then what happened is in 651, now we go back a few weeks when we talked about the Muslims and how the Muslims invaded and went west and spread Islam. Well, 651, the Muslim invasion happened, and there was a massive decrease in Zoroastrian. This was like the first sort of nail in the coffin. And although then they spread to rural areas where it became more of a folk, more, it wasn't centralized in the same way. And it was around this time that the Parsis were formed, or maybe Farsis, I don't know what they're called, if that's what, however you pronounce that, which is now the largest pool of Zoroastrian practitioners today, or those who consider that their faith. And I think in many ways this would also too, for many, be considered a philosophy like Hinduism. It's who, you convert to it, but you're converting to a cosmology, and then it's just a way of being. If you're going to be in it, you got to be in it. It's not like Christianity where you can do it halfway, you can do it all the way, you can do it in all sorts of different flavors. And then by the 11th and 13th century, you have another Turkish-Mongol invasion that basically almost eliminated it. In its backgrounds, we talked about, if you were with us on Sunday, we talked about Manichaeism. It is influenced by and has connections to Manichaeism, mostly in its understanding of good and evil, which we'll talk about in a second, and its relationship. But except for that, the Manichaeans believed that the world was evil, and therefore were ascetics and monks, and brought some of that influence, and thought we should flagellate ourselves because we're the broken vessels, and everything that humans are evil. More like Christians, Zoroastrians believed that there was a duality between heaven and earth, but not that the flesh itself was bad. So the need for asceticism was not there. Like Abrahamic religions, and I'm going to unpack a couple of these, not all of them, but I will try to unpack a couple of them. We share a cosmology relating to our understanding of the deity, what God is, one creator God. I'll go into more detail about that in a second. Our eschatology, meaning our end times doctrines, an afterlife, some sort of paradise established. We share that. We share the same idea of the resurrected body. And we share the notion of a final judgment, and that someday that darkness will be conquered and eliminated. We share the notion of a Messiah, or a figure that will return on that judgment day. The final prophet is what they would call it. And that this creator God is revealed to humans at various times in history through revelation. They have a robust doctrine of angels and demonology. They call them something different, but there are good celestial beings and there are evil celestial beings, and naturally there are different words for that. But they essentially do the exact same thing that ours do. They share 6 epochs of creation. They share free will, that we are creatures that have actions, that have effects. They share the idea that we are distinct human beings, or we are distinct from the rest of the world in the sense that we have a consciousness. We are conscious of our being in this world in a way that a dog is not conscious of its being. And within its folklore, within its mythology, or in its narratives, they have Zoroaster also having experiences on mountains, is very similar to Moses. And there is also a notion of this, and again, I think it's Feridon, and I don't remember, I think that might be, I want to say it's time, but I don't remember, so I'm going to hold off on that assertion. But I think that's what it is. But anyway, the notion of 3 suns. And I think it was water, fire, and time, or water, fire, and so I'm drawing a blank, and I didn't write it down. I went to get a coffee at that point, and I never came back to write. I'm realizing now that's right when I went to get a coffee, and I clearly never finished that note. But they have 3 sons, like we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They have this sort of succession. So and I'm not saying it's the same, to be clear. But when you take a religion that goes back and has these deep roots and they have a similar cosmology, that tells us a number of things. One, syncretism, aligning yourself with another religion by a choice or by culture, is common. It's going to happen. The Israelites were a religion that was developed in a bordering region and spent 70 years after the fall of Jerusalem in exile in a Persian country. And there are many married Persian women. Many adapted parts of Persian religions, as they did with the Canaanites, as they did with, you go to every region that Jews went to, they adapted some elements of that expression of faith into Judaism. In the same way, we as Christians, you adapt it to, it goes in various regions. So, there's a close link or tie, but I don't want to tie it too close to Zoroastrianism as much as I do just want to the plight of humanity in general. And if in this region we're recording what is happening or unfolding in religious thought or religious expression, it should not surprise you that there are similarities between all of these. It does not mean that something about our religion is false. It does lend itself to ultimately, and this is where we jump, if we jump ahead, and next week we'll look at Baha'i and a few other connected things. I don't know, I'm not going to promise anything because once I get into these, sometimes it gets, but Baha'i is the idea that all religions lead to God. It's kind of an Asian pluralism, in that you can be a Jew and still Baha'i, you can be a Christian and Baha'i, and it kind of incorporates the idea that in all of these there's a human, not anyone who says all religions are the same, that is a completely false statement. To say that religions have similarities and represent the human pursuit to understand the relationship between the divine and our humanity or human civilization is accurate. What I do think is interesting, as we look at all of these, that in every one of these world religions, I keep coming back to the fact that as we're going to look at some of their tenets, their basic tenets, is they center so much around the idea of doing good, helping. And it's like if everyone just truly practiced their faith, we would live in a vastly different world. Okay, let me stop there before I get into some of their basic beliefs and how it compares to our theology to see if there's any questions.
What religion is a family that Moses lived with before his experience with the burning bush?
The question for those online was, what religion did the family that Moses lived with? I believe it was some form of Judaism, but to be honest with you, I think now, didn't he take a wife of, I'm trying to, was it a Midian? It's still influenced heavily by Judaism in the region. So, but I don't remember exactly, I don't know. Yeah.
Did God tolerate his people borrowing these practices from, he did not want.
God, as when you say God, you're referring to our God, right?
Yahweh.
Okay.
From the Old Testament, he did not want his people worshiping idols. He was really, punishing against that. But if there were other religious practices, and even like in the New Testament, when the doctrine of the Trinity came, you're saying from Greek influences, is that okay with how God allowed his people to borrow from those other cultures?
Well, that's a question. For those online, the question is how did God feel about people borrowing from other? Well, in some sense, Judaism might have borrowed some of those things from Zoroastrianism. And this is, yeah.
But there were times when he said, you're going away because
yes,
you let those things influence you.
There were correctives in that. And I think the difference would be that I don't think Zoroastrianism at any point is trying, we'll talk about there is the name for God, but their name for God is Zora Mazda, which is Lord of Wisdom. Now, we might call our God the Lord of Wisdom. In other words, it sounds foreign to us, but in the same way I made the point when Allah is just the word for God in Islam. Zora Mazda the Lord of wisdom, it's their idea, and that is, and I'll jump ahead and just say it, all good, no evil God, creator God, omniscient, meaning all-knowing, but not omnipotent, all-powerful. And again, this is where the cosmology divides. There is the notion of the Angra Manu, which is the destructive or evil spirit. Now, they wouldn't go as far as Manichaeism, where these were two existing powers, but the relationship and the cosmology between these are that they coexist, but still that that in the end, that the power of light or Azura Mazda will conquer. Like, they have a cosmology that in the end, light will conquer all of darkness. And they have a cosmology of heaven and hell, and that they'll be judged on this final judgment, and they'll either burn or they'll get to go on. And they actually have a metaphor of a bridge that you go across, and in the middle of the bridge, you'll be judged. And if you're bad, you're going down, and if you're good, you're going across the bridge. So, yeah, Lynn.
Is there any place in the US that Zorros congregate together, like
Probably.
Mormons kind of stick together?
Yeah, I mean, with 14,000 in the U.S., there are groups. I mean, if you go to Eastern or Western India, you probably, near the Parsi people, you probably would have a lot there. But in terms of the U.S., 14,000, I mean, like, that's nothing. What is the population of Montrose? Probably smaller than that, but yeah, Glenda. No.
If their emphasis was on wisdom,
Yeah.
did that influence all that wisdom literature of the Old Testament?
Could.
And we read in the apocryphal books, there was a lot of, in some of those, there was a lot of
Absolutely.
emphasis on wisdom literature.
I think that wisdom is a common trait, not just from Judaism, obviously Zoroastrianism. I think that notion of wisdom, and what that. Yes, I mean, how much it influenced or where it was, but I mean, if the Israelites were 70 years, the span of an entire, our modern day generation in Persia, and they have Zoroastrianism, which is not that much different than Christianity in terms of it's the same cosmology. In other words, to jump from being a Christian to Zoroastrianism isn't a huge leap. It is a critical leap, because then they would view Jesus as a prophet, and then you're denying Christ's divinity, and that's what differentiates us as Christians. We believe that in the lifespan of history, that when the advent of Jesus coming into the world is God incarnate, and then there was a sacrifice play, because there's a larger sacrificial system also with early Zoroastrian, although not present day. That the sacrifice was needed to appease God or to satisfy God, as we talked about last week, and then the Spirit was given, and that Spirit ties our story back to that paradise garden when the Spirit of God dwelled in fullness in us. And so, yeah, I mean, and that's the strange thing. The whole time I'm studying this stuff, I'm asking myself again and again, why was this not more presented in my seminary education? And surely these professors understand that this was existing in the region, because there's no way to deny the influence. When you start to line up these categories, and as I go through with our doctrines and talk about that, I mean, it's remarkable. But they deny Jesus, and that's what differentiates us. Again, we confess Jesus as the Lord and Savior of the entire created order, world, time, space, everything. And that's ultimately what differentiates a Christian, and why you can't exist in a Buddhist system and be a Christian, or in Islam. I mean, I think it's easier to listen, it probably exist in an Islam system, but even then, I think Islam is sort of a false interpretation or a false expression or a wayward expression. When I've said this to a number of you over the past few weeks. I mean, this is opening up my mind to some stuff of saying, if Islam comes from Ishmael, and Ishmael was worshiping the God of Israel just as a wayward child, or as but God said, I'll make a great nation out of him. He's going to bless Ishmael, and he did in Islam. That's a great nation, and it's conquering the world in good ways and bad ways. But if that is the God, and they had a continuity of the worship of the deity, it means that Muslims today, in a way that we wouldn't agree with, but are genuinely worshiping the same God that we are worshiping. Yeah, let that rest with that. That'll keep you up at
They
night.
say that, they'll-
Oh, I know, they say that, but honestly, and I never have thought about this till I thought about Islam a few weeks ago, and I started tracing them back. I don't think it's the right worship. I think they're wrong in denying Christ, and I think therefore, by the virtue of our understanding of the confessional nature of Christ as Lord and Savior, they are outside of that covenant. But their worship, their dedication, the very thing they go to Mecca to surround that thing, and they're worshiping the same God we are. They're just not doing it what we would say appropriately.
Similar situation with the Jews.
What's that?
Similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we wouldn't, we would say, well, we're worshiping the same God as the Jews, and we're okay with that. Well, and again, for those of you who weren't with us in Islam, Judaism was a precursor to Christianity. Precursor is a precursor to Islam that came out about 700s AD. So we think, oh, well, it's okay. We're an extension of Judaism, carrying on. Well, Muslims are like, well, why wouldn't God continue to reveal? Now, again, the difference is they view Jesus as a prophet. In a nutshell, let me give you what they believe. This is Zoroastrianism in a nutshell. And again, it varies, but these are the three cores that go back to the very earliest forms, and they call it the threefold path. Not surprising that the Buddhists later took all their numbers and started numbering everything. Good thoughts. Humata, good thoughts. Nothing wrong with that. We should have good positive thoughts. Jesus tells us to dwell on things that are holy and pure and truth and righteousness. Again, goes back. Good words. Huksta. We should speak good words. Well, that's all over the scriptures too. We share that in common. Good deeds. Huvarshta. We should participate in good deeds. And all of these things for Zoroastrians should represent an altruistic good. Never for the sake of I'm doing them because my reward will be on the other end. And this is where it deviates from Eastern religions, because there's, the desire is, and even in Eastern religions, Buddhism, we talked about the intentions are what matter on a deeper level. You don't just do it for the sake of it, but the goal would be in doing it that it draws you into that intention. They're meant to, the belief is that if you participate in this threefold path of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, that it will assure happiness for yourself, and it will ward off the evil forces and the evil spirits and the chaos that seeks to be destructive to the world. And in doing so, not only do you find inner happiness, you find that you spread happiness. And it's sort of a sharing type thing, and where it comes to explicitly within their teachings, that comes out in charity. So they believe in helping and in giving, and again, not too far off from Judaism and many other things, which again, I will say, it does rock my thinking a little bit. And this is where I haven't, and again, this is a surface glance, but I always viewed Israelites as one of the first people who were given the command to show hospitality. And this is what differentiated them from the other religions. But again, religions that we're dealing with were around Israel, and we're, how many hundreds of miles east into Persia and east and western India. They believed that when you participate in these three things, that there is, and this is interesting too, and I wonder if this is more of a modern day thing, and again, I didn't get into it deep enough to find out, but the maturity, that there's a spiritual mutuality that should be given or experienced through all of humanity. And they actually have a very early doctrine of the equality of men and women in spiritual pursuit, which means that even if these thoughts were developed around 600 years before Christ, it means they were on that edge of understanding that sense of equality between men and women as being spiritual beings, and was already present there. Because Christ was really the first, although there were some things that were breaking down culturally through Roman and Greek influence, but in general, patriarchy still ruled the roost, as it did even over the last 2,000 years. But what's interesting is, this is what makes Christ's actions, again, so influential. Because Christ said, let little children come unto me. There's a dog that just came in. Is anyone missing a dog? Did the dog come in? I just saw a dog walk by. Okay, there's a dog outside.
Right there.
Oh, there's a dog that came in. Hello, you're late. Is that anyone's dog? All right, just a dog passing through. Oh, he's gonna lay down right there. What's up, buddy?
So, I have a question.
Yes,
So, the law
the law.
that was given to the Israelites.
Yes, and the Moses.
When you talked about all of the different correlations here, do they have, is the
Zoroastrians.
Zoroastrians have something like that?
They have yes, they have sacred text that's called the Avesta, and at the center of it is the Gatha, which are the sacred hymns of Zoroaster that are meant to center people. So they do have sacred texts, but they're not, again, as unified as the same as we would have. I don't know. Let me see if I could place that somewhere. I mean, really, it's less direct. I mean, the Israelites spelled those out in a lot of specific ways through the Levitical laws. No one talks about that. We talk about the Ten Commandments being given by God to Moses. That's just basic things to keep people in line. And then you get the Levitical laws that get pretty specific. I did not dig that deep into, because the sacred texts I have found, in my reading of it, didn't seem to come up as being as central as it does for Christians or Muslims in the modern day. This threefold path kept coming up. Like, if you have good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, this will sort of create what they call, and all of these are supposed to embody what they call asha, or in their language, arta, but they're two terms, and that literally means, there's no good word for it, I shouldn't say literally, it figuratively means truth, that which is right, righteousness, order, right working, and it's central, and that notion of asha is central to the Zoroastrian theology and doctrine, and some would actually go as far as saying it is the divisive confessional concept of Zoroastrianism, that we are meant to embody this asha that is realized through our thoughts, words, and deeds. And the opposite of that is called druj, which is falsehood or deceit, or that which the evil spirits or evil energies draw up within our lives. And the goal then is to become what they would call, and again, this is where you're seeing a bit of the Hindu influence, as an ashavan, a master of asha. That you're constantly in a state of bringing truth and light and righteousness and order into the world, much like Buddhism, or much like someone who becomes an enlightened one in Buddhism. I'm going to touch a little bit on that, and then we'll come back to it at the end. Again, I'm just scratching the surface of the theology, because it does. They have a doctrine of the Spirit, and this is where my notes get kind of. It's right here at the bottom too. They're highly, it is considered by world religion scholars that Zoroastrianism is a major influence in all of the Abrahamic religions, Gnosticism and its dualism, Northern Buddhism, and Greek philosophy, which I would say, and shares in existence with Hinduism. I think there's probably a more of a mutual relationship between the development of Hinduism as it spread east and Zoroastrianism as it sort of existed and spread west. And again, it's not we're like Christianity means this. I think that there's central things to Zoroastrianism, but we're talking about a historical expression with 100,000, just barely over 100,000 total Zoroastrians in the world. That's not much. It is probably one of the world's smallest religions, although it is one of the oldest. But it is a precursor and plays influence on all. So let's step in real quickly into, so just let me give the categories that we've talked about over the past weeks. their concept of the divine or God, they're monotheistic. They're considered the first monotheistic religion. I said that. Their God is, their label for God is Ahura Mazda, again, the Lord of Wisdom. That God has a they characteristic, so there is a plurality. But I didn't go too deeply into that. But is considered also omniscient, so there's an all-knowing, but not all-powerful. And again, because there's a battle, if it's all-powerful, the presumption is that why would there be evil exist in the world? Now, we have a cosmology that says God is all-powerful, but evil still existed. So, but we also confess that someday it will be conquered. This divine God, this Ahura Mazda, is supported by Amesha Spentas, 6 of them, in fact, and they're considered holy immortals. And they would be the most equivalent to our archangels. So in the same way, we have these powerful beings that go between the material world and the immaterial world that speak and offer divine revelation. They have the system as well. They just have different labels for it. And the cosmology basically says that the idea of Ahura Mazda is battling against this Angra Mainyu, and that this constant battle keeps, we're all sort of caught in this world of this battle, and eventually the Ahura Mazda will win. Humanity is defined by having free will, also a urvan or a soul as a part of who we are. And that is what connects us to Fravisha, which is their version of the Holy Spirit. And in that, when one is born, we say, what is someone before they're born? And we don't know what really happens. We don't know where the spirit, where the soul is. We don't know what the pre-existence of the soul in a human vessel is. And that's a pretty loose area within our understanding of theology and cosmology, is where did these spirit pre-existed before, non-existence, paused existence. We don't, other than the fact that there is some notion of pre-existence of the souls in Christianity, we don't have a concrete doctrine in any of our confessional statements that really sort of hones down on that, with good reason too. But the idea is that at birth, the spirit that was once down for Zoroastrians, that was dwelling with Fravisha, again, their spirit, that spirit comes out of that Holy Spirit and is then embodies the human vessel. They believe that there will be a judgment in death, and that there will be an apocalypse, something they call the Frashkor Karita, and that there will be a renewal beyond that. They don't believe in reincarnation. They actually take death pretty seriously, in the sense of they see death as being sort of the end, and they don't want to pollute the world, and so they don't want to put bodies in the grave. And they're considered the first ecologically focused religion as well, not only the oldest, but even in present day, it's caring. And you've seen this in all of them: the care for the earth, care for the animals, and particularly more in Eastern religions than in Western religions. But they have that strong doctrine of caring for creation. And so what they do is they used to, I don't think they still do, but they have these towers of silence, and they would put their dead up on the top of these towers and it would feed the birds. They would basically feed their dead to the birds, and then the sun would bleach the bones, and eventually they would turn to dust. The hot Arab summers, Iranian summers. That was eventually, they weren't allowed to do that, and they've had other ways, and now there's all sorts of ways of conventions that they happen to it. But the idea was that they didn't want to pollute the ground with a body.
That's Native American.
Yes, and again, you may see syncretism in that as well. I mean, if you buy into the whole notion of Pangea, that all the continents were one together way back thousands of years ago, and the idea that it spread. I mean, again, a lot of this, I don't know what everyone's tradition is. A lot of this is probably an affront to what I would say is more traditional understanding of world creation, evolution. You do have to take a longer worldview to kind of accept some of this stuff. And that's fair. And that they believe that in the afterlife, there will be, after the final judgment, and some fall off the bridge and some make it on, that there will be a final renewal, evil will be destroyed. The Redeemer is called the one, is called I don't know how to say these words, Frashen, Carry, anyway, the one who brings the benefit. They view Jesus as a prophet. They call him Asas Shayat, I don't know, I mean, I'm butchering all of these. I shouldn't even be trying. And they view the Holy Spirit as being different, or an essence of this creator God, and one that sustains this project. Which again is right in line with the idea of our creator God. We call him creator, redeemer, sustainer. They don't have the redemption sacrifice narrative in the center in the same way we do, but more so that if one does good, and one operates in good thoughts, good words, good deeds, that your salvation is secured. So you might argue that basic sense of, I've heard this so many times in 30 years of ministry, what about my neighbor who's so nice and doesn't do anything wrong and treats everyone lovely, but doesn't go to church and really doesn't really believe in, doesn't really ascribe to Christianity? Well, truly in our Christian, it's pretty cut and clear. Jesus says before his disciples, in his own words, that those who acknowledge me, before others, I'll acknowledge before God. And those who reject me before others, I'll reject before God. You really can't cut that in any other way than to say that we participate in a religion of exclusivity that is experienced through divine revelation to the individual, and through that we are restored. Now, I think that we as Christians can exist in this world and believe that we are the fullest expression of the one divine God we call Yahweh, or call Adonai, or call Jesus, Holy Spirit, Trinity, whatever you want to call it. And I do believe that in God, in that schema, God could also reconcile other parts of the world through other means. I don't confess that, but I'm not denying God's capacity to do whatever God wants. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges of modern day Christianity. In affirming our own confessional statements, we want to demonize the others and reject the fact that God could use other means to reconcile the world. Who am I to tell God what God can do? This is the same reason I'm not confessing that I think that evolution has to exist in millions of years, and that there are some humanoids that came from some form of monkeys. I'm not suggesting that we have to accept that. I'm leaving room that maybe God developed the world and animals and creation through means outside of my understanding of the sacred texts. And I believe that actually ultimately is the right posture of humility. That's genuine humility, not like, oh, don't tell me. Their cosmology is that there is a presence of both good and evil, heaven and hell, angels and demons, and that existence is a temporary state for us as humanity. That we're here for a temporal time. And so very much, again, like Christianity, or like Judaism, or like Islam. The ephemeral nature of the material world that we put emphasis in is squandering our time and energy and place in this world, that we ought to be this sort of eternally minded individuals. And the eschatology is that eventually everything will be conquered by good will conquer all evil. Just real quickly, they worship in a similar way to, probably more similar to, they do prayers. They pray towards fire or any light, because fire is huge in their mythology. They believe that's where, the sort of intersection between its light, its energy, it has power. And I didn't get too deep into the whole fire thing, but fire comes up. They have an internal fire that they have to keep lit. And if it goes out, you have to restart the coals. There's a big process through it, through which to sort of relight the fire. They have something called a yasna, which is a worship guide. It tells them how they ought to worship. And this is where, comparison to us as Westerners, the way the manner in which you worship would feel more akin to like Hinduism or that region of the world. They originally had a doctrine or an understanding of sacrifice, and that's not to say that it wasn't part of it there now, and not in general. Killing in general is a bad thing. They believe that that the fires are sort of again I wrote sacred, whatever, sacred fire. Oh, that what was it? There was something about fires being a sacrifice. I'm drawing a blank now. There was some relationship between fire and sacrifice. They don't really have sacraments in the same way we do. There aren't these holy sort of things that they do. They do believe in the dualism between heaven and hell and a sort of a multi-tiered world. What do I have right here? Oh, that Agra Magno, the evil forces, made the earth evil space, made it a place of decay. And destruction and desolation, and that light will eventually renew. You know, God's going to come back and renew everything, kind of new heaven, new earth. The dominion, it goes back to our scriptures and our notion that the dominions of the world were given. You know, that the world was given to Satan, and this was part of it. Where when Satan is offering Jesus to be king over all, you know, to have control over all the kingdoms of the world. The reason that wasn't just an idle offer is because the dominions of the world were part of Satan's domain, the evil one's domain. And so that same cosmology of that Christ redeemed the world and made all things new is there as well. They believe in eternity and that we're bound in history. Again, I talked that the sacred text is not as prominent as it is for us, although it still factors in. Their festivals, they have festivals just like Hindus, and they seem to me, I mean, again, you get a whole list of festivals in another language, and it all looks kind of like gibberish. And I didn't go down the path of any of them, but the birth of Zoroaster is considered a holy day in all sects of this. But some of them celebrated on different times in different places. And Sada, the Festival of Lights, which would be similar to Diwali, I believe Diwali, and not it's Holi's color. So there's a Festival of Lights and Fire, kind of like the Jewish Hanukkah, celebration of light, the return of light. And they have much written, and it goes on and on about the mythology around fire and the way fire embodies the essence of God. And so wherever there's fire present, it's considered kind of holy. It's, you know, they take fire far more seriously than we do. So, all right, that's shorter. I probably would have had time to do maybe Baha'i, but I think that would have probably that would have been in short. Baha'i, I guess, and I'm going to come back to it, but as a combination, it is considered. If this is considered the oldest religion, Baha'i is considered the newest world religion, second fastest growing. For those of you who watch The Office, you know, The Office show, The Office, Dwight from that show is apparently Baha'i. I was watching an interview this week about it. He was interviewed about it. And it is very much a do good, don't do wrong, don't harm, you know. And again, we see this theme week after week in the sense of what we're studying. So, all right. With as much as I know, what are your questions? Anything? And online, if you have anyone online, you can turn on your mic. So let me turn this up too.
We don't know much about Jesus when he was growing up.
Yeah.
I got the impression he was a very gifted scholar. Do you think he studied other religions besides Judaism?
I don't think that the studying of other religions was probably as prominent because really world religions came out in the last couple centuries. That notion that we ought to study. I mean, I think that's what globalization does. You know, you go back a couple hundred years in middle of America, no one really cares what's going on in China or Australia or wherever. So I think the answer would, you know, I don't think, not that he wouldn't have been aware of that there were other existing views, but, and I think Jesus probably had a greater awareness, but again, I don't know.
Something certainly influenced him to change a lot of his views about religion from what Judaism had presented them.
Well, I mean, you know, when you want to boil Jesus's message of what we call, you know, of a faith to live out. I mean, again, we call it Christianity, but it's just Judaism. I mean, he wasn't like, hey, here's a new form. It's Judaism, or what we call Judaism. It was it was removing the idea that we are works-oriented,
Divinely inspired.
Yeah, I think, well, just that we're called, I mean, it's the whole narrative, it's the redemption, for Jesus, the whole redemptive narrative, and that really denying oneself daily, putting others before ourselves is a way to this place of, but yet we're bound by sin and none of us do it, so, yeah, Glenda.
You've been emphasizing that these other religions
It's just like nice and loud.
influenced Judaism and Christianity over time. Did Judaism and Christianity influence them?
I would say probably. I think that, and again, I'm just scratching the surface for all this, but the fact that this came out, or Zoroaster is dated back to the time where the Israelites were also being redefined, is very interesting to me. Not only in the sense of, this is where, how do I want to say this? This is where your understanding of how the Bible functions as a narrative, if you want to make it if you view the Bible in absolute perfect terms, and what it is perfection, and we just have to sort of try to interpret it, then it doesn't allow for the category of influencing one or the other. But if you look at the history of humanity as the constant fusion, influence, spreading, merging, we're all fusion. There's no purity in any of us. I mean, that's what the idea of a child is, the fusion of two people into one. So it's a constant fusion. So I guess in short, to answer your question, I don't know how, unless one believes that God is ordering everything in a perfect formation and protecting in certain places, you would be able to assert that the Jews weren't an influence on the Persians, and the Persians weren't an influence on the Jews. What we discover in the story of Esther is an edict to rid everyone of rid Susa of the Jews, and then an edict that says you can kill people who are trying to do that, and then worshiping or a respect, a fusion of the Persian king's understanding of the God of the Israelites. How that played itself out over hundreds of years, I mean, and then you bring in, again, there have been the influence of the Roman Empire and the colonization, you bring the conquering of the Greek and Alexander the Great, and all those, the convergence of all of these things. You have to take all of these things into consideration. Again, we wouldn't be who we are without the Hellenization of the Greeks. The very notion that God is omnipotent and perfect and without form, all of that's Greek stuff. That when we look back at the God portrayed only by the Israelite scriptures, if you separate those two and you say, this is the God of the Israelites, and you list all those characteristics, and then you can juxtapose that with the God of the New Testament, and then you juxtapose both of those with the view that we have constructed about God, you've got a schizophrenic God, unless you can find unity in it. And we do, and for me, I find unity in that in the brokenness of humanity. And this is where I come back to, I believe in the holiness of scriptures. I believe that they are infallible. I believe they contain the truth. I believe Jesus Christ is the fullest revelation of who God is. And I believe the Bible is the human attempt, guided by the Spirit, transferred through thousands of years to this present day form. They tell us and help us understand who God is in our relationship with that God. And the only reason we ascribe perfection to that text, as we'll find out for those of you who are in the church history series on Sundays, is because the Reformation needed to double down on something. Because in the absence of a pope, where do you find ultimate authority? Well, the only thing they had was the written word, which had only really been popularly distributed for less than 200 years. So, and that doesn't mean I have a low view of Scripture. I think actually it means I have a pretty high view of Scripture, because if I can look at the brokenness of what Scripture comes and the inerrancy and the problems with transmission and translation and all of those cultural manifestations, and I can still have faith in the story that exists beneath all of this thing, that's what I call both a high view of Scripture and a high view of God's message in it. So, Jim.
So the religion was started in 6,000 BC?
They think there are some that's, and again, it goes back to some, but 6,000 would be, you know, and this would predate even our dating of Adam and Eve.
Right.
So you have to accept an older view. And then the next marking would be about 2,000 before Christ. And this is where the Vedic, I mentioned that earlier, that sacrificial system that came about 2,000 to 1,700. Again, if I recall, I think Abraham is Abraham 14? I don't remember. Is Abraham 2,000?
David's 1,000.
David's 1,000, but is 1,000 years between? I think it's like, is it 12? I don't remember. 1,200? I don't know. I did it when I did the Bible timeline history. I don't remember the history of when Abraham. I mean, and honestly, people are guessing to some extent, but Abraham is usually where they start to feel like the dates are more generally. You know, Noah is pretty loosey goosey, and there's no telling where Adam and Eve and the rest of them all were. I mean, you know, we have educated guesses, but even the education is based on speculation. So, but no doubt, all of these things were influencing each other, and part of it is, again, culture. You move west, you have far more this dualistic cosmology. The Greeks influenced it, obviously the Zoroastrians influenced it, the Persians influenced it, Israel, Judaism influenced it. You go west, you have more reincarnation. Why do they believe that? Because they were raised in that environment. And those are that's what the culture believed. So if you were raised in China as a Chinese person, you would think that what we believe is sounds kind of silly because their cosmology exists differently. So, and ultimately I say those things because that's meant to point us towards the grace. That, like, when we're talking to Buddhists or Hindus, not to condemn them. I mean, yeah, we don't believe they have the truth, and that's okay. But I think there needs to be compassion and grace and understanding, and for someone who is a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist who are devout in their faith, to have a mutual respect. I don't agree with them. I don't think that they are saved in that, unless there is a pluralistic God. Then fantastic. Oh, that's all good. I mean, like, as a Christian, we shouldn't really want to deny anyone eternal bliss. That doesn't mean that God's sense of justice is satisfied. And who's to say we even fully understand that? I'd venture to say we probably don't. But we are a mirror and a representation of that earth. And what we do see in all these religions we studied is a sense of good thought, good words, good deeds. Now, we as Christians don't believe that those are necessary for our salvation, but we do as Christians believe that those are necessary parts of a life of discipleship. So, any final questions or thoughts? We'll get it out a little early. Smaller religion. Actually bigger, maybe, not smaller. No? All right. Well, that's it for today.
Thank you.